Good morning, everyone, and welcome to my experiment in presenting. I'm Charles Gasper, your personal tour guide, and today we're going to be considering content analysis, the methods underlining it, as well as some issues, as well as what you kind of get out of the process when you're all done. So what is content analysis? Well, to barely begin, it's an effort to understand qualitative data. It's a way to kind of get in there, get your hands in there, and try to figure out what it is all this qualitative data means. So what qualitative data may you ask this could apply to? Well, any number of things. I've seen it now with newspaper articles, books, even those wonderful little surveys that you put out at the end of a presentation that ask things like, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? Or what would you like to learn more about, or whatnot? These are opportunities for the participant to kind of give us additional feedback, but you kind of need a technique to kind of dig through that data, sift through it, and find the underlying patterns and themes in the responses, as well as kind of categorize them according to value. I'm sure a few of you have had experience with looking at evaluations of presentations, and oftentimes we get in the response set of, is there anything else you'd like to tell us? We get things like, the room is too hot, the room is too cold, the food was great, the presenter was fantastic, location was great, could you turn up the temperature, could you turn down the temperature? You'll see a couple things that were repeated there, and that related to temperature. Well, some of the categories that you kind of can boil out of content analysis are tied to that. So in this case, the room was too hot, room was too cold could be in the category of temperature, or could actually split into too hot or too cold, depending on information and how often things appear and how important they are to the person reviewing it. Now, most of us, when we ask the question about what else would you like to tell us about the presentation, really could care less whether or not the filet mignon was delicious or not, but rather are interested in whether or not the people who participated got something out of the presentation, or did we miss something, or is there a topic they want to engage in going forward? And so that's why we categorize them, but then we tend to kind of dump off some of the stuff that isn't really important. So again, as I said here, it can be applied to all forms of data from the media. And again, I'm kind of using words here, but there are other forms of media, audio, spoken word, as well as video. A friend of mine who's a graduate student up in Milwaukee is actually doing her dissertation looking at secretaries from the 1920s to the 1970s, and kind of how the executive assistant or secretarial group has evolved in the media over time. And so she's literally watched movie after movie after movie after movie about secretaries, and has done a content analysis of those movies to get information such as aspects of sexism related to them, aspects of roles within the organizations as perceived by the media, and things like that. So there are a lot of interesting ways you can engage in this methodology to pull good information out of data. So how do we go about doing this? Well, obviously, first we have to do is data collection. Now, as I said, my friend up in Milwaukee, she basically has a ton of secondary data that was basically created for another purpose. The purpose was to entertain the public, movies. However, as I mentioned also, you can have some primary data as well, such as surveys with open-ended questions. On the analysis side of things, and really this is all about categorization, there are kind of two different methodologies you can go about to kind of get there. One of them is inductive, which is kind of the process of kind of reading through the material and the rater interacting with the material, kind of walking their way through it and creating categories as they go along. So again, in the example of my creation of the category of temperature, maybe I saw a lot of responses having to do with room hot, room cold, hot, was cold, felt sweaty, whatnot. That kind of all got, as I went along, I developed this category of temperature that I could put in there. That's an inductive process. These things kind of evolve over time. It's kind of like putting a bunch of data in the soup, boiling it out, and then these kind of categories remain. On the deductive side of things, what we usually end up doing there is we have categories kind of on the front end. We've already thought about things. So again, an example of looking at the open-ended response to the survey, I may have already said, okay, there's just going to be certain things that we want to code a little differently, or each category a little differently. So I may have one about the presentation. I may have one about the presenter. I may have one code for temperature. I may have one code for food, one for location, one for new topic, one for this topic's been done too often, and so forth. And I may come up ahead of time and then code things in. The advantage of the inductive methodology is that you are kind of interacting with that data and finding and discovering patterns as you go along. Deductive, you've already got your code book set. Everything's kind of coded and locked in. Now, the methodology most people kind of go through, it appears, when they do this type of technique, is they start off with an inductive process. They kind of go through the data and they react to it, they interact with it, and they identify certain categories ahead of time as they go through, and then they come back and redo it, re-look through the data using the deductive methodology, saying, okay, now that we've kind of created these categories, do they still make sense? Do they still hold water? And invariably, you get this kind of other category, and things can split out of that as well. And there is an aspect of how deep you go. Because if you noted, my categorization initially, as I described this, were temperature, room, size, maybe food, and presenter, and topic. They're pretty broad. You really can't get much information out of that other than we get counts of how many people were excited about the room or had something that they wanted to say, excited enough that they wanted to complain or say yay about the room or about the presenter or whatnot, but it really doesn't tell us any underlying meaningful information. So you have to kind of dig down and create smaller subcategories and branch them out to get to where you want to go. There's an aspect of coding as well. As I said, you need to code these responses. So there may be a simple word, it may be a phrase, it may be a statement that you give a certain code to that means something. When I do my content analysis, frankly, I use the numbers 1 through whatever, and then eventually start collapsing coding and so forth in the inductive process, and then come back and do a deductive to make sure everything still makes sense. But you do need to code the data so you can do some type of analysis. There's also an aspect of significance. When you're doing this methodology, you can't really go back to a statistical test often and say, well, significantly more people said X versus Y, if only because oftentimes, again, with an open response set, you're not quite sure the data set, there's aspects or issues related to that, but also there are times when you're going to get data out of this that just can't be coded for statistical analysis. I should clarify, you can do some of this coding to apply your statistical analysis at some point. Again, I may have temperature and I may have cold to hot or something like that, and it's a 4-point scale or something like that that I've coded relative to chunks. But oftentimes, the data really doesn't lend itself to some type of statistical analysis. So that's when we get into this notion of, well, how do you determine whether or not the data is significant or not? And basically, Patton has this term he calls substantive significance, which kind of refers more to whether or not the data was something you kind of expected, whether or not it triangulates with other data, whether or not it's really important or not. So again, something that was not very important, such as talking about just temperature in general, we won't even look at. Even though a lot of people may mention the temperature, it's not important to the process, it goes. So here's some examples. First of all is this notion of word search, and I have a wonderful picture here of to educate. So the simplest way you can engage in an automated version of a content search is to use Microsoft Word and go through a document that's in Microsoft Word and type in, for me it's Command F, but for you Microsoft people it might be Alt F or whatever, but it's the find command. And you might type in the word educate and look how many times it appears within the document. That is a very simple way of doing some type of content analysis. The trick is that content, that word educate, must be meaningful. So I've seen this done in some media analysis looking at various news broadcasts about groups and the words around hate. So you may count how many times the word hate appears in a broadcast, or anger, or something to that effect, to get some sense of tone or how things are viewed by the media who's presenting this. So that's kind of the first level. Again, just looking for a specific word. It's a real simple example. There's also this concept of concept categorization, and Hallie Preskill, who used to teach at CGU, who actually now is off with FSG as a consultant, she has this really cool experiment that she does to kind of demonstrate this, and I think Tarek may have experienced this at some point or seen it, or I don't know, maybe I may actually be spoiling the beans for a project later on. But basically, it's looking at candy. So, it's Halloween. It's a good time to be thinking about candy. I know my daughter is. And you've got a bowl full of candy, and you've got all different types of candy. And I were to just give you the bowl and say, sort the bowl. So you might sort it one way. You might sort it by chocolate versus not chocolate. And then I say, okay, you know what? I bet you can sort another way. Let's think about this. Why don't we look at round versus oblong? And so you sort it another way, and another way, and another way. And there are many different ways of looking at candy. We could look at M&M Mars versus, good Lord, I can't even think of another chocolate, Hershey's company, and you could sort it by that way. But basically what it is that you're finding patterns within the data to create these kind of concepts or categories. Again, I have here this concept categorization versus concept development. So concept categorization, you ahead of time said, I want to sort this by chocolate versus not chocolate, because that's what came to mind. Or you wanted to say round versus oblong. I gave you that. Or round versus rectangle. Or different types of chocolate companies or candy companies. That's concept categorization. You already have the concepts you want. You're just putting them into the categories. In concept development, that again is that method of inductive analysis. So you're kind of going through the candy. You're going through the bowl and you pull out one, you pull out another and say, okay, this is a Snickers bar. This is a Milky Way. Are they similar or different? Well, there's some similarities and differences. So maybe you pull out a third one and it turns out it's a Sunburst candy, something like that. Sunburst or Sunkissed, it's a a fruit jam or something to that effect. So you go, oh, chocolate versus fruit. But then as you keep going through the data, you start categorizing based off of different things that you encounter. This is kind of that concept development. You're creating the various concepts that you're going to consider. And obviously, this all kind of boils into this notion of themes or patterns within the data that you're trying to pull out. Now, some key issues in content analysis that you need to consider. First of all, much like any other research study you might engage in, sampling is critical. You need to get a representative sample of what you're looking at. So again, referencing my friend up in Milwaukee, her sample is pretty simple in the sense that she's only looking at the American representation of the secretary from the 20s through the 70s. However, if you were going to say generalize that to the world's view, I don't know if that works. So you may need to sample from England, Germany, France, but then, okay, that's a Eurocentric potentially viewpoint. So maybe we need to start looking at movies out of China or something to that effect. So again, being able to draw that representative sample is critically important. There's also aspects of reliability, both between raters and replication. So again, we're developing concepts based off of oftentimes, especially in an inductive situation, a researcher interacting with the data. Well, that's all fine and good, but I've had experience where I will look at a piece of data or a set of data set and categorize it one way, and somebody may do it something differently. Think again to that bowl of candy that we were talking about. If I gave two of you two different bowls, one person may categorize it one way, one person may categorize it another way. There needs to be rationalization between the raters. And you develop these concepts or categories in such a way that somebody can come along at a later time and replicate what you do and come up with the same results. So that's kind of a key issue in this process. Finally, there's this notion of substantive significance, again, that Patton mentioned. And this is something that, I admit I'm a quantitative guy. I'm used to quantitative analysis, and so some types of qualitative analysis make me a little nervous, and this notion of looking at data, looking at patterns in data and kind of deciding based off of other findings, is this important or not, or based off the research question, is this significant or not, frankly leaves me a little light, so to speak. However, it does demonstrate that this type of methodology could be used to, at least this technique looking at substantive significance, could be used to augment some findings elsewhere. Now, in the case of what I'm doing with content analysis, we're going to be looking at relative tone, and we're actually coding values to intensity of that tone. And as a result, we have something that we can quantify and do some quantitative analysis on. So obviously, I feel a little bit better. With that, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask for if there are any questions.